A few days ago we were in mind on Mount Olivet, looking at the Lord's footprint as he left our geography. We heard the words of St Luke reporting the Lord, giving an indication that they were to remain in Jerusalem until they were empowered. And then they were to be his witnesses. And we have these concentric circles coming in Jerusalem, where they were, Judea, in Samaria, and then, bit by bit, to the uttermost bounds of the world. That then is the context of the beginning of the book of the Acts, the end of the Gospel of St Luke. And here we have the fulfillment of that, for on this day, the last normal day, as it were, of Eastertide, before Pentecost itself, we have the end both of the Acts and of the Gospel of St John. And what do we find at the end of the Acts? This 2-year period of free diffusion of the word in the centre of the known world, Rome, by the apostle of the Gentiles. He's not hindered, he's in his own hired property of some kind, and he's able to speak to people. For us, it's important here in the West, here in Ireland, in the extreme West. For in Rome, the vehicle of communication begins to change. Even though at Rome itself, much Greek is spoken, the language of culture is Latin, as it is in North Africa. And these two centres will give us a Latin vocabulary for church notions, theology, and all that goes with it. And the language then will become, for the whole of the West, Ireland, Wales, Scotland included, despite the existence of ancient languages of their own, Celtic in origin. And we have this common factor. For all these centuries, these ancient monks, these priests faithful to the gospel, these missionaries eventually will use the same venerable Roman canon coming from precisely Rome, which we're still using to this day. We're therefore handling the same words, the same sounds, the same sacred syllables that brought heaven to earth morning after morning by all these saints of the West. Greek remained in the East important, and is still important, for a huge block. But then with the spreading further and further afield, other languages came on board, of Slavonic origin notably. And also a diversification with time of traditions and liturgical tendencies. A certain sobriety being the characteristic of the West to this day, compared with the very ornate, prolonged, florid style of the East, which has its huge advantages, by the way, as well as some disadvantages, for we are more able to adapt to, for instance, missionary situations and urgency. Well, we reach Rome, and then in the end of St John, read on this day, we have part of the second conclusion, for it is clear that the original mind of the Apostle John was to finish after the shock of the resurrection. And then we have this prolonged afterthought. And thank God that he was inspired to put it down on parchment, for these stories come through him alone, and they're beautiful. One thing we can take with us from this reading is the way that St John, who always speaks in the third person, hinting who he is, of reference to the one who reclined on the breast of the Lord at the Last Supper, quotes, and with insistence, the very words of the Lord with regard to himself, said to Simon Peter, who had asked him about this one. If it is my pleasure that he should remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Now, the words follow me are addressed also to us, and so is that hint that we should not be too curious about other people's things, but we should be very curious about our state of soul and relationship, and it should be about that. It should all be about that, our relationship. The big difference between our faith is that it is not a mere religion, but all about a relationship. If one looks carefully at the spirituality of other faiths, one can see a difference, a big difference actually in the case, for instance, of Islam, compared with our tendency to look in different directions. There is a certain fear and trembling of the Almighty in some religions, compared with our own loving embrace of Jesus, partly because we have him here in the tabernacle and on our tongue. We touch our God. That there's bound to be a big difference between that relationship and somebody who's fearfully awful and out there at a distance. There is a difference, let's face it. And it heals, because loving somebody is not the same as going through life in fear and trembling. It's not the case for every soul, of course, in any other religion. They're all different, but the tendency is there. Our faith is about relationship, and the practice of, for instance, spending many hours in adoration is bound to change that relationship compared with an observance of a religion. It's different. It's actually much simpler, because it starts from a different side, a different end, from the inside outworking itself spontaneously to the outside. Why? Because the soul that loves and knows somehow spontaneously knows what is pleasing to the one that is loved, and therefore by a certain taste of things spiritual we interpret the divine will from moment to moment. We know that this would be the will of the lover in this situation. We just kind of know it. It's different. And the Spirit is given to us so that may be the case. On this vigil of Pentecost, it is important that we implore all the gifts of the Spirit and all its fruits, one of which actually is joy. And true Christian life has that notion of joy. A good monastic community has a twinkle of joy. There is, as it were, a feeling of serenity in the air, whatever's going on, because the bottom line is homeward bound. We're on the winning side, and therefore all else is relative. One who had a lot to suffer and yet had joy in the Spirit was the saint of this day, Rita. From an early age she wanted to belong to Jesus, alone and solely, but her parents insisted, and they had the power to do so in those days, that she married. And a match was found, it seems, who turned out to be a difficult and actually at times violent husband. But she stood with him, and from him had 2 sons. He was involved in the political situation of tension and even violence of the period, factions, what we would call sort of holy gangs, and the result was that he was in bad company. But yet her gentleness and prayer and penance conquered him, and he became docile and available unto God. But then, leaving that circle that he was involved in, it led to a backlash and violence to him. So he was assassinated. And the young sons vowed to have vengeance on the assassins when they came to age. And when she picked this up, she prayed intensely that the Lord would take them rather than allow them to offend him in this way. So if they were to live and do that, that he would rather intervene in time and stop it. And he did. And they died young, which left her free. Many women today are in a very bad marriage. In canon law, one looks into certain things that might vitiate the actual sacramental consent. So there are cases where we can look into that to see if the marriage was entirely valid at that point. Because there is one thing which can make it invalid, and that is guile, dolus, when one is, as it were, purchasing an article which is not what we think we're purchasing. In other words, there has been some kind of fraud in the article, the human article. And the proof would be if once the person has been gained in marriage, immediately afterwards a change takes place, so that one has a new person, the one that didn't come into mind when we're married. It's an element of cheating the person into consent, and also hiding things which are important for that consent. It can be looked into. But having said that, normally one does try one's level best to do like St Rita and maintain the marriage and keep it together. There are cases which are limit cases, and one is precisely when there's physical violence involved. That is a study of its own. With regard to the saint that we have, she is a model for those who do actually stand by their man until death and accept the consequences with regard to frustration on the affective level. They can be used but not loved intensely as they need to be and want to be, but they stay there. And the Lord is their consolation. When eventually all these died, she tried then to fulfill her plan, her desire from childhood, and she tried to get in to the Augustinian convent at Cascia. But the Mother Superior wanted her to have complete reconciliation with those who were involved with the assassination of her husband. She went that far and obtained it. But then there was another problem. There were widows of those involved in violence, and violence concerning her family, in the convent. So it became very difficult for the Mother Superior to accept her. And she was not being accepted until eventually, in some kind of dream or vision, her own patron saints appeared to her, St Augustine, St Niccolo de Tolentino, and St John the Baptist, and they intervened miraculously to get her in to the convent physically, and she found herself there and was therefore taken in. And she was a model of self-effacement, obedience and humility. And the extent of her obedience can be seen in the way that she obeyed in watering this plant all through the winter when there was no hope of it ever sprouting. But the rose came out and flowered in midwinter. Hence the practice on this day, in Italy especially, of blessing red roses and giving them out to the faithful. It's her sign. And she's very popular in Catholic countries like Italy, known to be the saint for hopeless causes, the saint of the impossible, as she's called. And one finds her power. Years ago, in the monastery, she was not being feasted liturgically, but I decided to have a Holy Mass privately in the Carolingian chapel. And I was amazed that throughout the celebration, out of nowhere, came this powerful perfume of roses. And I checked, and there was no rose in sight in the chapel or in the bin or anywhere. And the same thing actually happened this morning here during adoration, when we also were venerating St Rita. A strange whiff of powerful heavenly roses was coming through, like a gust. And not from any roses that might have been there. She is around. These then are our friends, and the Trinity binds us together, all the persons of the Trinity. And the person that links us all and links the Trinity together is love personalized, the Holy Ghost. So all our faith and all our life is a breath and a fire. And if we're not breathing warmth, but giving off chilly vibes, we are in a religion and not a living relationship. And that would be a profound tragedy, given where we're coming from. In questa festa di Santa Rita pensiamo a tutte queste famiglie in difficoltà, a tante mogli nascoste che tengono insieme una famiglia in crisi, con violenza almeno psicologica. Spesso uno trova una situazione di questo tipo e uno deve, parola ci deve dare di incoraggiamento, perché è facile di lasciare il matrimonio, però se è un matrimonio vero, la grazia può essere recuperata. Si può realizzare un matrimonio in difficoltà. Le rite di questo mondo esistono ancora, rimangono dentro, si sacrificano. Il marito può essere guadagnato, come è stato il caso da Santa Rita stessa. C'è però un caso limite in cui si trova una situazione in cui, per esempio, esaminando la storia, una persona è stata quasi forzata, la volontà è stata sollecitata con mezzi strani, di maniera che si dà questo consenso sacramentale, ma che si consente una cosa non conosciuta. L'articolo non è quello che è indicato, per esempio cose nascoste, carattere falso, e lì c'è un problema forse a livello del sacramento stesso, è una base per la nullità, e questo oggigiorno capita purtroppo spesso, e dunque la delicatezza e l'ascolto ci vuole, ma in generale lo deve incoraggiare sempre a tenere quanto possibile il matrimonio insieme e non lasciare la grazia che può anche rivivere. Ci sono tanti esempi di matrimoni recuperati, un po' di dialogo anche con la terza persona insieme può recuperare una tragedia apparente. Oggi l'instabilità non aiuta. Matrimonio ad experimentum. E purtroppo cominciare avendo già fatto tutto prima non aiuta, da una mentalità di usa e getta. Santa Rita stessa è un esempio dunque per noi di vita eroica nascosta, santificazione nella sofferenza, e anche la possibilità di guadagnare gli altri tramite l'amore fedele e la penitenza e la pazienza, che si è visto anche nella sua vita religiosa, obbedienza in questo caso al superiore, e anche a livello eroico la storia delle rose. Queste rose sono ancora qui, sono grazie per noi e si sente qualche volta i nostri amici invisibili sono molto molto vicini.
Vieni, vieni, Spirito d'amore, ad insegnar le cose di Dio. Vieni, vieni, Spirito di pace, a suggerir le cose che Lui ha detto a noi. Noi ti invochiamo, Spirito di Cristo, vieni tu dentro di noi. Cambia i nostri occhi, fa che noi vediamo la bontà di Dio per noi. Vieni, vieni, Spirito d'amore, ad insegnar le cose di Dio. Vieni, vieni, Spirito di pace, a suggerir le cose che Lui ha detto a noi. Insegnaci a sperare, insegnaci ad amare, insegnaci a lodare Dio. Insegnaci a pregare, insegnaci la via, insegnaci tu l'unità. Vieni,